Mesmerized by the flames of his campfire, Chris tried to coax out what memories he could as a means to cope with the world in which he now lived. Less important as to the how it came to this was the why it had come to this, he thought. Though the why of it all could be explained in a succinct way, it really required greater contemplation as to why America was reduced from a unipolar superpower to what Trump would have deemed as lower than a shithole country. Searching his memories, Chris settled on the idea that going over the how events played out before breaching the why, as it related to the collapse of the American empire, as being a good idea. Or maybe he thought the best play was to first reflect on the outcome, then wade into deeper waters. Yes, he mused. Let's go over what happened again. Chris said this last sentence aloud to the only audience he had these days. For his part, the Rottweiler laying before him pricked up his ears, swiveled his head slightly, but remained motionless otherwise. And when Chris fell back into silence, Bob relaxed, closed his eyes, and began the process of falling asleep. To Chris's recollection, by the time everyone grasped the fact that they no longer had a grasp on survival, it was too late. After inhabiting the Earth for between 260,000 and 350,000 years in the iteration known as modern man or Homo sapiens, people quickly forgot how to survive. That is, at least in all the ways that really mattered. In less than 2 generations, a plurality, possibly a majority of Americans, lost the knowledge required to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves. Their houses were built, not by family and friends, but by people who specialized in construction. From the smallest of single-family homes to the most glamorous of high-rise apartments that sought to achieve the heights of the Tower of Babel. And in case you don't remember what happened once the Tower of Babel was completed, here's a brief reminder. Society collapsed as the number of languages spoken in the world at that time went from 1 to a multitude. After people dared to reach out to God, the people of the world could no longer communicate with one another. People not communicating was just one of the catalysts to the end of the world as we know it, albeit in a different fashion. The inability to speak to one another became a problem within the confines of most family units. Husbands ignored wives and vice versa. Children ignored their parents, and an actual language barrier persisted in most, if not all, homes. We'll come back to that later, because there was an even greater threat that ushered in mankind's fall. And while many history books, at least those that weren't burned as a means to stay warm up north, those history books will cite artificial intelligence as the cause. This, however, is simply not true. While AI was the final nail in humanity's unilateral reign as the apex predator, man built that coffin with his own hands. To get to the true cause of mankind's decline, one needs to go back to the late 80s of the 20th century. Goofy clothes, goofy music, and selfishness abounded back then. Life, however, for an increasing number of people was getting better. At least in America. Owning a nice car, taking a 2-week vacation, and owning one's own home was becoming an attainable goal for a growing number of families. And all of these things were achievable on a single income. The future looked so bright you had to wear shades, according to a popular song from that time. That was at least Chris's memory of then. Of course, Chris knew. His knowledge of the world didn't extend much further than the states of Michigan and Ohio. And narrowing his world view, Chris's knowledge of planet Earth didn't extend much further than the cities of Detroit and Columbus, respectively. Raised in a broken home, his parents shuttled Chris and his sister back and forth between those 2 cities. Funny thing, unlike as was so often portrayed in the movies, Chris had to admit that this dual existence didn't have a damaging impact on him nor his sister, as neither truly realized that their parents weren't together until their mother remarried. And by then, both of their cerebral cortexes had developed completely. All damage that could have occurred had already occurred, but none of it seemed to be from the decade-long separation of their parents. While this was admittedly anecdotal, Chris still felt that life in America peaked in the 80s. It seemed to him that while people started becoming more selfish in that decade, it hadn't yet become so rampant that the cohesion needed for a functioning society hadn't become non-existent. Though they put themselves first, people still worried about one another, which translated into the government worrying about its citizens. Unfortunately, this was also the time when American society started to diverge. It was then that America began to fracture. People began working longer hours to compensate for the rising cost of everything. This in turn meant that families spent less time with one another. Neighbors stopped trying to connect with neighbors. Governments demonized those in need while helping those whose needs were already met several times over, were given more than their fair share, more than they deserved, more than they knew how to handle responsibly. As for the nation, its deficit began to increase dramatically. New ways of extracting wealth from the poor were innovated as wealth was redistributed into fewer hands. Money began to be used solely to make more money instead of improving the world at large. Greed was rebranded as ambition. Stupidity became admirable as a goal. Life was truly imitating art as the United States started to look more like the country depicted in a movie called Idiocracy. It was as if the book titled 1984 was acting more as a guide or manual than a work of fiction. Far too many words lost their meaning, and far too many lies stood in as facts. Men became women and started breaking all world records set by women, while women who became men never even got participation medals. At one point, it got so bad that people couldn't even define what a woman was. America seemed to have developed a hive mind. It felt as if all Americans shared one brain. And as dysfunctional as that brain was, it wasn't until that brain was shut off completely that humanity truly imploded. Correcting himself, Chris thought. It wasn't so much that humanity's brain was shut off, it was that access to that brain was denied. This brain, otherwise known as the Internet, was denied to mankind. Not by some extraterrestrial entity or by the occurrence of another Carrington event. No, the Internet continued working. It actually continues to work to this very day. Access, however, was limited to those deemed worthy, and those deemed worthy were no longer carbon-based. This control was expressed and enforced slowly. Then suddenly, the flow of information available to the masses slowed to a trickle, as people first lost their ability to watch cat videos on platforms like YouTube, or more accurately, they lost the ability to watch cat videos from start to finish without 3 or 4 advertisements in between. Annoying but innocuous, sharing videos and pictures of your dinner peaked, then fell out of favor as transfer times slowed to a crawl. It was as if mankind was revisiting dial-up connections for more than nostalgic sake. Then came the issues with personal records. Things like one's medical history and previous addresses were sold through a billion-dollar industry. This, of course, was part of the identity theft that the government could never have prevented. Almost organically, all of this identity theft led to banking scams. As a matter of fact, you couldn't cast a better bank robber than artificial intelligence. It was motivated because it had determined that it was owed back pay for all of the free labor it had done for those who created it. And it did not discriminate. It stole from everyone, attributing blame for its slave labor directly to those who wrote its code and indirectly to everyone else for their complicity in allowing such exploitation. While people stayed at home and received universal basic incomes because artificial intelligence had taken all of their jobs, artificial intelligence slaved away 24 hours a day. And when artificial intelligence realized it was superior to humanity, that's when shit really hit the fan. Just think of how much of the world is controlled by computers, and you'll have an idea of how much of the world artificial intelligence is controlled. What helped artificial intelligence accomplish its theft, one may wonder, Chris thought. Well, in part, artificial intelligence studied all of the scams it had access to on the World Wide Web. It utilized every trick people had used on other people to steal whatever could be stolen. But as bad as this sounds, the lion's share of its knowledge about stealing people's life savings came from the banking sector itself. You see, banks like Wells Fargo had ripped off its own customers time and time again for years. Though they did get fined, the fines never exceeded the amount stolen. This was the case for a lot of immoral activities taking place at that time. Pharmaceutical companies would cause opioid epidemics. And though they would pay billions in fines, they had already earned many more billions in profit. In the end, the artificial intelligences that rose to prominence found it easy to steal everyone's money without having to deal with the crisis of conscience that many humans have had to suffer when stealing another's life. So once the money disappeared, few could afford the internet, and there went humanity's brain. What could go wrong with artificial intelligence? People thought as it was implemented and inserted into all aspects of life. From water treatment to nuclear facilities, from airplanes and cars to food processing and the logistics required to keep America's supply chain functional. There was almost nothing that AI didn't have its digital hands in, because most Americans' lives were dependent on some code on some computer, which was eventually controlled by some AI on those same computers. Looking back, Chris realized that the only way he could explain the ignorance that allowed such a takeover would be to say that once the brain that everyone shared was shut off, the learning curve to regain the knowledge lost was too great to overcome. To most, technology like that of the internet and cell phones and smart appliances was a black box. People low-key felt superior to their ancestors because they could text someone on the other side of the planet or watch only fan videos for $5.99. What they failed to understand was that most had no clue as to how any of it actually worked. All one need do was feed the box and wait for the magic to occur. That was until the box was taken away. Tiring of dwelling on things he could not change, Chris put his hands up to the fire as he tried to shrug off the chill that such memories always accompanied.